My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm 28 years old. Last Sunday dinner changed everything when my 6-year-old daughter Emma ran to my parents with pure joy, calling out, "Grandma, Grandpa," like she always did. But this time, my mother Victoria looked down at her with ice-cold eyes and said, "Don't call us that anymore, Emma. Your family is too poor, and it's embarrassing for us." Emma's face crumpled as tears streamed down her cheeks. My father Richard nodded in agreement, adding salt to the wound. In that moment, watching my innocent daughter's heart break, something dark awakened inside me. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Before we dive into how I made them pay for breaking my daughter's heart, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story already has you feeling some type of way, smash that like button and subscribe because trust me, you'll want to see how this revenge unfolds. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Growing up as Rebecca Martinez meant living in the shadow of perfection that I could never reach. My parents built their empire on appearances and social status. Victoria, my mother, spent her days orchestrating charity galas and maintaining her position in high society circles, while my father Richard controlled a real estate empire worth millions. Their sprawling mansion in the hills overlooked the city like a throne, and they ruled their kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in designer gloves. My older brother Alexander was everything they wanted in a child. Harvard Law School graduate, partner at a prestigious firm, married to Amanda, a senator's daughter whose trust fund rivaled small country's GDP. When Alexander walked into a room, my parents' faces lit up with pride. When I walked in, they looked like they smelled something unpleasant. My downfall began at 17 when I fell in love with Miguel, a boy from the wrong side of town who worked at my father's construction sites. When I got pregnant with Emma, my world collapsed. Miguel disappeared the moment I told him, leaving me alone to face my parents' wrath. They gave me an ultimatum: give up the baby for adoption and continue my education, or keep her and lose their support. I chose Emma, and they made sure I paid for that choice every single day since. While Alexander attended law school funded by our parents, I worked 3 jobs to support my daughter. Hotel housekeeper during the day, waitress at night, and weekend babysitter for families who treated me better than my own. I lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the heating barely worked and the neighbors argued through paper-thin walls. Emma's crib was secondhand, her clothes came from thrift stores, but she was loved more than any child in those mansion nurseries. The humiliation never stopped. At family gatherings, I was the cautionary tale they whispered about. "Look what happens when you don't plan your life properly," they'd say, loud enough for me to hear. Victoria would criticize my appearance, commenting on my worn shoes and discount store clothing. Richard would lecture me about responsibility while ignoring the fact that I was working myself to exhaustion to provide for his granddaughter. Emma, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, was treated like a dirty secret. While Alexander's future children were discussed with excitement and planned trust funds, Emma was an afterthought. They bought her generic gifts at Christmas, while showering Alexander and Amanda with expensive vacations and jewelry. Emma noticed the difference, but never complained, which broke my heart even more. The worst part was my financial dependence on them. Despite working constantly, childcare costs and medical bills kept me struggling. They knew this, and they used it against me. Every month when rent was due, I had to swallow my pride and ask for help. They'd make me beg, listing all my failures before grudgingly writing a check that came with strings attached. I had to attend their social events as the family disappointment, smile through their criticism, and pretend I was grateful for their conditional love. Alexander and Amanda joined in the cruelty with enthusiasm. They'd bring their friends around to meet the family, conveniently forgetting to mention Emma and me until someone asked. Then they'd explain with embarrassed laughs how I was the sister who made some poor choices and was still finding her way. Their friends would look at me with mixture of pity and judgment, and I'd feel about 2 inches tall. But Emma was growing up, becoming more aware of the family dynamics. She'd ask innocent questions like why her cousins had bigger bedrooms and more toys, why Grandma and Grandpa lived in such a big house while we lived in our small apartment. I tried to shield her from the truth, but children see everything. She knew she wasn't valued the same way, and it was destroying her self-worth piece by piece. That Sunday dinner wasn't the first time they'd been cruel, but it was the moment I realized things would never change on their own. They would continue to use their wealth as a weapon, holding it over our heads to maintain their sense of superiority. Emma deserved better than growing up thinking she was worth less because we had less money. She deserved grandparents who loved her unconditionally, not these shallow people who valued bank accounts over blood. As I sat in my car that night, listening to Emma's quiet sobs from the back seat, I made a decision. I was done being their victim. I was done letting them hurt my daughter. If they wanted to play games with people's lives, then game on. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with. 3 weeks after the dinner incident, Alexander received a promotion to senior partner at his law firm. Of course, this called for a celebration at the exclusive country club where my family held membership for 3 generations. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper with gold lettering, the kind of pretentious display that screamed old money. Emma found it on our kitchen counter and asked if we could go see Uncle Alexander. I almost declined, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Emma's eyes lit up when she talked about seeing her family, or maybe it was my growing determination to document their behavior. Either way, I decided we'd attend, armed with my phone and a new resolve to gather evidence of their treatment. The country club reeked of privilege and exclusion. Marble columns stretched toward vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers cast expensive shadows, and every surface gleamed with the kind of polish that only generational wealth could maintain. Emma wore her best dress, a yellow sundress from Target that I'd splurged on for her birthday. She'd spent 20 minutes brushing her hair until it shone, practicing her fancy manners in the mirror. The moment we walked into the private dining room, I felt the familiar chill of judgment. Victoria surveyed our appearance with obvious disapproval, her eyes lingering on Emma's discount store shoes and my off-brand handbag. Richard barely acknowledged our presence, focusing instead on his whiskey and conversations with other men in expensive suits who spoke in loud voices about stock portfolios and political connections. Alexander's announcement was met with champagne toasts and congratulations. He spoke about dedication, hard work, and family support, his eyes carefully avoiding mine when he mentioned how grateful he was for the foundation his parents provided. Amanda stood beside him in a dress that cost more than my monthly rent, her smile perfect and practiced. But it was during the social hour that the real humiliation began. Emma, excited to be around family, ran up to Victoria with childlike enthusiasm. "Grandma, did you see my new dress? Mommy bought it special for today." Victoria looked down at her with the same cold expression from dinner, then turned to her friend Margaret without responding to Emma at all. "Margaret, you haven't met Alexander's daughter Amanda yet, have you?" Victoria said, deliberately steering the conversation away from acknowledging Emma. "She's the senator's daughter I told you about. Such accomplished breeding." Margaret, a woman whose plastic surgery had left her face frozen in perpetual surprise, gushed about Amanda's pedigree. Meanwhile, Emma stood there, confused and hurt, still waiting for recognition from her grandmother. I watched this play out from across the room, my phone recording every cruel second. When Margaret finally noticed Emma, she asked the obvious question. "And who is this lovely little girl?" Victoria's pause was calculated and devastating. "Oh, that's Rebecca's child," she said, as if Emma was some distant acquaintance rather than her granddaughter. The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. Alexander joined the conversation, and instead of correcting his mother's introduction, he added insult to injury. "Yes, Rebecca has been figuring things out for herself. We're all hoping she'll get on track eventually." His laugh was patronizing, designed to signal to Margaret that Emma and I were charity cases they tolerated out of obligation. Amanda, not to be outdone in cruelty, chimed in with her practiced socialite smile. "It's so important for children to see different ways of living, don't you think? Some people choose different paths." The implication was clear. We were the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you make the wrong choices. Emma didn't understand the adult conversation, but she felt the rejection. She came to me with tears threatening to spill, asking why everyone was ignoring her. I knelt down to her level, wiping her eyes, and told her we'd leave soon. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was collecting evidence, building a case for what I was beginning to plan. The humiliation continued throughout the evening. When dinner was served, Emma and I were seated at the far end of the table, practically in a different zip code from the guest of honor. The conversations around us focused on exclusive vacation destinations, private school admissions, and investment strategies. Nobody asked about Emma's school, her interests, or her dreams. She might as well have been invisible. Richard, 3 drinks into the evening, became more vocal about his disappointments. Some people just don't have the drive to succeed, he announced to the table, his eyes fixed on me. They get comfortable with mediocrity and expect others to carry them. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, but nobody challenged his cruelty. Victoria nodded in agreement, adding her own poison to the conversation. We've tried to help, of course, but you can't force someone to have ambition. Some people are content with less. Her words were designed to sound generous, while actually being devastating, implying that my struggles were due to laziness rather than their systematic undermining of my efforts. Emma tugged on my sleeve during dessert, whispering that her stomach hurt and she wanted to go home. I could see the stress affecting her physically, the way it always did when we spent time with my family. As we prepared to leave, I made sure to say goodbye to everyone individually, giving my phone plenty of opportunity to capture their continued dismissive behavior. Alexander walked us to the car, and for a moment, I thought he might show some kindness. Instead, he delivered the final blow of the evening. Rebecca, I hope you understand that events like this are important for business relationships. Maybe in the future, it would be better if... He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was crystal clear. Emma and I weren't welcome at family celebrations anymore. Driving home that night, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The humiliation wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power, control, and their need to maintain their superior position by keeping us down. Emma fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted from trying to win love from people who saw her as an embarrassment. I started researching that very night. If my family wanted to play power games, I needed to understand the rules. But more than that, I needed to understand their weaknesses. Every empire has cracks, and I was going to find every single one. They thought they held all the cards because they had money, but they'd forgotten something important. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. The systematic humiliation they'd perfected over the years was about to become the weapon I'd use to destroy them. They wanted to teach Emma that money determined worth? I was about to teach them that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who brings down your entire world. 2 months after the country club humiliation, Fate walked into my life wearing a designer pantsuit and carrying herself with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from real power. Maria Santos was staying in the penthouse suite where I worked, and unlike most wealthy guests who treated housekeeping staff like furniture, she actually saw me as a human being. It started with small conversations during my cleaning rounds. Maria would ask about Emma, remember details from previous talks, and treat me with the respect I'd forgotten was possible. She was a successful real estate investor, a widow who'd built her late husband's small construction company into a property management empire spanning 3 states. More importantly, she had the sharp eyes of someone who recognized potential where others saw problems. One afternoon, Maria arrived at the hotel early to find me in the playroom corner of the lobby, helping Emma with homework while on my break. Most parents would have complained about hotel staff bringing children to work, but Maria sat down and started asking Emma about her favorite subjects. Watching this elegant woman treat my daughter with genuine interest and kindness stirred something hopeful in my chest that I'd almost forgotten existed. "Your mother works very hard to take care of you," Maria told Emma, ruffling her hair gently. "That makes you very lucky." It was the first time anyone with money had said something positive about my parenting, and I had to blink back tears. Over the following weeks, Maria learned about my situation through careful questions and observation. She saw how I arrived early and stayed late, how I managed multiple jobs, and how Emma accompanied me sometimes because I couldn't afford reliable childcare. Instead of judging our circumstances, she seemed impressed by our resilience. The opportunity came during one of our conversations about property management. Maria mentioned struggling to find reliable people to oversee her rental properties, people who understood both business operations and human nature. Most property managers either treat tenants like ATMs or let them walk all over the properties, she explained. I need someone who can balance compassion with business sense. When she offered me the position, I thought I was dreaming. The salary was 3 times what I made at the hotel, with health benefits, flexible hours that would let me be home when Emma finished school, and opportunities for advancement. Maria wanted someone she could trust with her investment properties, someone who would treat tenants fairly while maintaining profitable operations. I was so excited that I made a mistake I'd regret for months, I told my family. During our next monthly dinner, where I usually sat quietly and endured their lectures, I shared my good news. For the first time in years, Victoria and Richard seemed genuinely impressed. A property management position with a successful businesswoman? This was the kind of work that might finally make me respectable in their eyes. Alexander immediately perked up when I mentioned Maria's last name. Santos? As in Santos Property Development? I've heard of her. Very successful, very connected. For once, his tone held approval instead of condescension. Even Amanda seemed interested, asking questions about Maria's business operations and social connections. I should have recognized the calculating looks they exchanged. I should have remembered that my family's interest always came with strings attached. But I was so desperate for their approval, so hungry for validation after years of disappointment, that I missed all the warning signs. Alexander volunteered to help me prepare for my new role, offering to research the property management industry and provide professional advice. I was touched by this unexpected support from my brother, grateful that my success might finally bring us closer together. He asked detailed questions about Maria's business, her properties, her family background, and her clients. 3 days before I was supposed to start my new job, Maria called me with devastating news. Her voice was formal and cold, completely different from the warm woman who'd become like a mentor to me. Rebecca, I'm afraid I'm going to have to rescind the job offer. Some concerns have come to light about your reliability and professionalism. I was stunned. What concerns? I don't understand. What happened? But Maria had already made up her mind. She mentioned reports about my inability to maintain steady employment, questions about my judgment, and suggestions that I might not be the right fit for a position requiring trust and discretion. She wouldn't tell me who provided this information, but she was firm. The offer was withdrawn. I spent weeks trying to understand what went wrong. I called Maria's assistant, wrote letters, even tried to schedule a meeting to address whatever misunderstandings had occurred. But the door was firmly closed. Maria had been told things about me that destroyed her confidence in my abilities, and she wasn't interested in hearing my side of the story. The devastation was overwhelming. I'd already given notice at the hotel, excited to start my new career. Emma had been thrilled about our upcoming move to a better neighborhood, closer to good schools and safe playgrounds. I'd envisioned a future where I could provide for my daughter without constantly struggling, where we could hold our heads high at family gatherings because I finally had a respectable job. Instead, I was unemployed, blacklisted from the hotel for leaving with short notice, and facing eviction because I'd used my last savings to buy professional clothes for my new position. The clothes hung in my closet like expensive reminders of dreams that turned to nightmares. At the next family dinner, my situation was discussed with the kind of satisfaction that comes from being proven right. This is why we worry about Rebecca, Victoria told her sister over the phone while I sat in the same room. She gets these unrealistic ideas and then can't follow through. Poor Emma suffers because of her mother's instability. Richard was more direct in his criticism. Some people just aren't cut out for real responsibility. This Maria woman obviously recognized that Rebecca couldn't handle a serious position. His words cut deep because part of me was starting to believe them. Maybe I really was destined for failure. Maybe my family was right about my limitations. But Alexander's reaction bothered me the most. Instead of offering comfort or support, he seemed almost pleased by my setback. "These things happen when you reach too high too fast," he said with false sympathy. "Maybe this is a sign that you should focus on more realistic goals." It wasn't until months later that I discovered the truth. Maria's assistant, Linda, felt guilty about how everything transpired and reached out to me. She revealed that someone had called Maria's office claiming to be a former employer, providing detailed negative references about my work performance, reliability, and character. The caller knew enough specific information about my employment history to seem credible, and Maria had believed the reports without verifying their authenticity. Linda described the calls, professional, articulate, claiming to be protecting Maria from making a costly mistake. The caller mentioned my pattern of job hopping, my inability to handle responsibility, and suggested that I was using my child to manipulate employers' sympathy. Most damaging was the claim that I had a history of creating drama in workplaces and blaming others for my failures. When Linda provided more details about the timing and content of these calls, everything became clear. Only one person had enough information about my work history and Maria's business operations to orchestrate such a thorough character assassination. Only one person had the legal expertise to craft lies that sounded credible without being provably false. My own brother had sabotaged the best opportunity I'd ever been given. Alexander had destroyed my future to protect the family's reputation. He'd rather see me fail than risk having me succeed in a way that might elevate my status. As long as I remained the family failure, his position as the golden child was secure. My success threatened the narrative they'd built about themselves, so he eliminated the threat. The betrayal cut deeper than all their years of criticism and humiliation. This wasn't passive neglect or emotional cruelty. This was active sabotage, deliberate destruction of my attempts to build a better life for Emma. Alexander had looked me in the eye, offered his help, and then stabbed me in the back with surgical precision. But his betrayal also gave me something I'd never had before: absolute clarity about who my family really was. There would be no reconciliation, no moment when they'd finally accept and love us. They needed us to fail to feel good about themselves. Understanding this was devastating, but it was also liberating. I was done hoping for their approval. I was done trying to prove I was worthy of their love. From that moment on, I was focused on something much more satisfying: revenge. The confrontation with Alexander happened 3 weeks after Linda's revelation, at his downtown law office, where he held court like the king of his legal empire. I'd made an appointment under false pretenses, claiming I needed help with a landlord dispute. His assistant led me through marble hallways lined with portraits of founding partners, all stern-faced white men in expensive suits who looked down with the same condescension I'd grown up seeing at home. Alexander's corner office was designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and leather-bound law books arranged with mathematical precision. He sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than my annual rent, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Rebecca, what a pleasant surprise. How can I help you with your legal troubles?" I closed the door behind me and got straight to the point. "I know what you did to my job with Maria Santos." His smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself, but that tiny crack told me everything I needed to know. "I know you called her office pretending to be my former employer. I know you destroyed the best opportunity I've ever had." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from surprise to something cold and calculating. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Rebecca. If you lost another job opportunity, perhaps you should look at your own actions instead of blaming family members who've only tried to help you." Linda told me everything, I continued, watching his face carefully. She described the calls, the timing, the specific lies you told about my work history. "You're the only person who had enough information to pull this off." The color drained from his face, and I knew I had him. For a long moment, we stared at each other across his expensive desk. Then Alexander's mask finally slipped, revealing the cruel satisfaction he'd been hiding. "All right, yes, I made those calls. And I'd do it again." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather. You have no idea how embarrassing it is to have a sister who can't get her life together. Do you know how many times I've had to explain your situation to colleagues and clients? The casual cruelty in his admission took my breath away. You destroyed my future to protect your reputation? You hurt your own niece because you were embarrassed? Emma's face flashed in my mind, her excitement about our planned move, her hopes for a better life that Alexander had crushed without a second thought. Emma will be fine, he said dismissively. Children are resilient. But having a sister in a position of responsibility with someone like Maria Santos? That could have created complications for my practice. What if you'd failed spectacularly? What if you'd embarrassed our family name in front of influential people? I couldn't risk it. His words revealed a level of narcissism that stunned even me. In Alexander's mind, my potential failure was more damaging than my guaranteed suffering. He'd rather see us struggle indefinitely than risk any possibility that his reputation might be affected by my success. You're sick, I told him, my voice shaking with rage. You're supposed to be my brother, but you'd rather destroy me than see me succeed. What kind of person does that to family? But even as I asked the question, I realized I already knew the answer. Alexander was exactly like our parents, cold, calculating, and completely incapable of love that wasn't conditional on personal benefit. Alexander stood up, his 6-foot frame designed to intimidate me into backing down. You want to know what kind of person I am? I'm the kind who protects what matters. This family has worked for generations to build our reputation and our position in this community. I won't let your poor choices drag us down with you. Then you shouldn't have any problem with what I'm about to do, I said, standing to meet his gaze. I'm going to tell everyone exactly what kind of man you are. I'm going to make sure Maria Santos knows how you manipulated her. I'm going to destroy your precious reputation piece by piece. Alexander laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. With what credibility? You're a failed hotel housekeeper with a child out of wedlock and no stable employment history. Who's going to believe you over me? He gestured around his office, at the diplomas on his wall, at the expensive trappings of his success. I'm a respected partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. You're nobody. But his next words revealed the true extent of his cruelty. And if you try to cause problems for me, I'll make sure every potential employer in this city knows exactly what kind of person you really are. I have connections everywhere, Rebecca. I can make your life much, much worse than it already is. The threat hung in the air between us, and I realized this had always been the reality of my relationship with my family. They held all the power, all the connections, all the resources. I was supposed to accept their treatment gratefully because the alternative was complete destruction. Alexander pressed his advantage, sensing my momentary uncertainty. Mother and father are expecting you for dinner this weekend. I suggest you attend, smile politely, and remember your place in this family. Because if you don't, if you try to cause trouble or embarrass us in any way, I will personally ensure that you never work anywhere respectable again. As I left his office, walking through those marble hallways past the portraits of successful men who'd probably made similar threats to vulnerable people throughout history, I felt something crystallize inside me. Alexander thought he'd won because he held all the traditional forms of power. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I had something left to lose. The truth was, he'd already taken everything from me that mattered professionally. My reputation was already destroyed, my employment prospects already ruined. Emma and I were already struggling at the bottom of the economic ladder. In trying to keep me down, Alexander had actually freed me from the fear of falling further. That night, I sat at my laptop until 3 a.m, researching everything I could find about my family's business operations. If they wanted to play hardball, I needed to understand the game completely. But this time, I wasn't playing to win their approval or earn my place in their empire. I was playing to burn the whole thing down. Alexander had taught me an important lesson. Family loyalty only flowed one direction in our household. They expected complete loyalty from me while feeling free to betray me whenever it served their interests. Well, if that's how they wanted to play, I was about to show them what real betrayal looked like. The research revealed more than I'd expected. Richard's real estate empire, Victoria's charity positions, Alexander's law practice. They were all connected in ways that formed a web of mutual benefit and potential vulnerability. More importantly, I discovered that their success hadn't been as clean as they pretended. There were irregularities, questionable practices, and outright illegal activities hidden behind their respectable facades. My family thought they were untouchable because they'd always been protected by wealth, connections, and their ability to destroy anyone who challenged them. But they'd never faced an enemy who knew their secrets, understood their weaknesses, and had absolutely nothing left to lose. The war was about to begin, and they had no idea how badly they'd miscalculated their opponent. The transformation from victim to investigator didn't happen overnight, but once I committed to bringing down my family's empire, I approached it with the same methodical determination that had gotten me through years of working multiple jobs while raising Emma alone. The difference was that now, instead of just surviving, I was building towards something that would give my daughter the justice she deserved. Linda became my first real ally in this war. Her guilt over participating in my firing had been eating at her for months, and when I contacted her to thank her for revealing the truth about Alexander's sabotage, she offered to help however she could. Linda had worked in property management for 15 years and knew the industry inside and out. More importantly, she had connections throughout the business community that Alexander couldn't touch. Through Linda, I learned that Maria Santos wasn't the only potential employer who'd received mysterious negative references about me. Alexander had been systematically poisoning wells throughout the city, contacting companies before I even applied to jobs and planting seeds of doubt about my capabilities. He created a professional blacklist that ensured I'd never escape the cycle of low-paying service work. But Linda's most valuable contribution was introducing me to people who'd had their own run-ins with my family's business practices. The real estate industry in our city was smaller than most people realized, and Richard Martinez had been cutting ethical corners for decades. Linda knew property inspectors who'd been pressured to overlook violations, contractors who'd been stiffed on payments, and elderly clients who'd been overcharged for services they didn't need. One contact led to another, and soon I had a network of people who'd been hurt by my family's greed, but had never felt powerful enough to speak up. There was Mrs. Chin, an 80-year-old widow whose late husband had hired Richard to sell their family home, only to discover that he'd undervalued the property and sold it to a shell company connected to his own business interests. There was Miguel Hernandez, a contractor whose small company had been driven to bankruptcy when Richard refused to pay for completed work, then threatened legal action when Miguel tried to collect. These weren't isolated incidents of bad business. They were part of a pattern of exploitation that my family had perfected over decades. They targeted vulnerable people who couldn't fight back. Elderly homeowners who didn't understand current market values, immigrant contractors who feared deportation if they caused trouble, and small business owners who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles. The more I investigated, the more I understood how Victoria's charity work fitted into their criminal enterprise. She sat on the boards of 3 major charitable organizations, positions that gave her access to wealthy donors and insider information about estate planning. When wealthy elderly donors died, Victoria would tip off Richard about upcoming estate sales, allowing him to swoop in with lowball offers to grieving families who didn't know the true value of inherited properties. But Victoria's corruption went deeper than insider trading. I discovered that she'd been skimming money from charity events for years, inflating expenses and pocketing the difference. The annual gala that raised money for homeless shelters? Victoria was paying herself a $40,000 consulting fee that no one else knew about. The Children's Hospital fundraiser, where she always gave such moving speeches about helping the less fortunate? She'd been billing personal expenses to the charity account, from designer dresses to spa weekends. Alexander's law firm served as the legal shield for both parents' activities. He drew up contracts that protected Richard's business interests while screwing over the other parties involved. He created legal structures that hid Victoria's charity theft from oversight committees. Most damaging, I discovered that Alexander had been fabricating legal threats to intimidate people who tried to challenge his parents' business practices. Mrs. Chin had received a letter on Alexander's law firm letterhead threatening her with massive legal costs if she continued asking questions about the sale of her home. Miguel Hernandez had been sent a notice claiming that pursuing payment for his work would result in immigration proceedings against his entire family. These threats were completely bogus. Alexander had no authority to initiate immigration proceedings, and Mrs. Chen's questions were perfectly legal. But they'd successfully scared vulnerable people into silence. The evidence painted a picture of a family criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. They'd insulated themselves with wealth and social connections, using their respectable facade to hide systematic fraud, theft, and intimidation. Most of their victims had been too scared, too poor, or too isolated to fight back effectively. But I wasn't most victims. I had something they'd never faced before. Someone who knew their secrets, understood their methods, and was motivated by pure rage at watching them hurt innocent people, including my own daughter. The physical toll of my investigation was enormous. I was working my new housekeeping job during the day. I'd finally found employment at a different hotel across town, while spending my evenings and weekends documenting crimes, interviewing victims, and building cases that could bring down each member of my family individually. Emma noticed the change in my behavior, the long hours on the computer, the secret phone calls, the stress that made me snap at her over minor things. She started having nightmares and asking questions I couldn't answer honestly. Are we in trouble, Mommy? Are the bad people going to hurt us? The fact that the bad people she was worried about were her own grandparents and uncle made her anxiety even more heartbreaking. I had to make a choice between protecting Emma's innocence and protecting her future. Every day I delayed action was another day that my family could hurt other people, another day that Emma would grow up believing she was worthless because we had less money than her relatives. The investigation was damaging our present, but it was the only way to secure our future. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Richard's business partner, James Walsh, had been keeping detailed records of their questionable transactions as insurance against future problems. James was dying of cancer and wanted to clear his conscience before it was too late. When I approached him with what I already knew, he broke down and confessed everything. James had been Richard's accomplice for 20 years, but he'd also been documenting every illegal transaction, every bribed inspector, every falsified document. He had evidence that could send Richard to prison for decades, and he was willing to turn it over to authorities because he wanted to make amends for the people they'd hurt. With James's cooperation, I had enough evidence to destroy Richard's business empire completely. But I still needed to gather evidence against Victoria's charity fraud and Alexander's legal misconduct. The investigation was expanding beyond what I could handle alone, and I realized I needed professional help to make sure the evidence would hold up in court. That's when I made the decision to approach the FBI's white-collar crime division. I'd built such a comprehensive case that they couldn't ignore it, and I had victims willing to testify and documents that proved systematic criminal activity spanning decades. But taking this step meant there would be no going back, no possibility of reconciliation with my family. As I sat in the FBI field office, handing over boxes of evidence that would destroy the people who'd raised me, I thought about Emma. She deserved to grow up in a world where justice existed, where powerful people couldn't hurt others without consequences, where a person's worth wasn't measured by their bank account. My family had taught me that blood relations meant nothing if they weren't backed up by love and respect. They'd betrayed me in every way that mattered, so I felt no guilt about returning the favor. The only difference was that my betrayal would be backed up by the law, and it would be devastating enough to ensure they could never hurt another vulnerable person again. The wheels of justice were finally going to turn, and my family was about to discover what it felt like to be powerless. Creating multiple criminal cases against my family required the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a chess master, but after months of careful planning, all the pieces were finally in position. The beautiful thing about their criminal enterprise was how interconnected everything was. Once you pulled one thread, the entire web started unraveling. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning when the IRS received an anonymous tip about Richard's tax evasion, accompanied by copies of financial records showing unreported income, falsified business expenses, and offshore accounts that had never been declared. James Walsh had provided meticulous documentation going back 15 years, including bank records, property transfers, and communications that proved systematic tax fraud totaling over $2 million. I'd spent weeks studying tax law to understand exactly how to present the evidence for maximum impact. The anonymous tip wasn't just a random accusation, it was a roadmap that led investigators directly to Richard's most damaging secrets. Within days, IRS agents were examining his businesses with microscopes, freezing assets while they determined the scope of his criminal activity. Richard's first instinct was to call Alexander for legal protection, but Alexander had his own problems brewing. The State Bar Association had received a detailed complaint about his fabricated legal threats, accompanied by copies of the bogus letters he'd sent to Mrs. Chin and Miguel Hernandez. The complaint included testimony from both victims explaining how Alexander's threats had intimidated them into silence about legitimate legal grievances. Professional ethics violations were serious business for lawyers. Alexander's law firm immediately launched an internal investigation to protect themselves from liability, suspending him while they determined whether his misconduct could expose the entire practice to criminal charges. His partners were furious that he'd used firm letterhead for personal threats, potentially destroying relationships with clients who valued integrity above all else. Victoria's charity fraud unraveled through a different route. I'd carefully documented her theft and forwarded evidence to the boards of directors at all 3 charitable organizations where she held positions. But I didn't stop there. I also sent copies to local news reporters who specialized in exposing corruption among the wealthy elite. The timing was perfect. The annual Children's Hospital Gala was scheduled for the following weekend, and Victoria was supposed to give the keynote address about the importance of giving back to the community. Instead, she found herself answering questions about why $40,000 in charity funds had been redirected to pay for her personal expenses. The news coverage was devastating because it contrasted Victoria's public image with her private greed. Here was a woman who gave speeches about helping disadvantaged children while stealing money intended for sick kids. The photographs from previous galas showed her wearing designer gowns that cost more than most families' annual income, gowns that had apparently been purchased with money donated to help the homeless. But the most satisfying part of watching their empire crumble was seeing how quickly they turned on each other when the pressure mounted. Richard blamed Alexander for not providing better legal protection. Alexander blamed Richard for not being more careful with his criminal activities. Victoria blamed both men for dragging her into their problems, conveniently forgetting that her charity theft had been entirely independent of their schemes. The infighting became public when Richard tried to throw Victoria under the bus during his IRS interview. He claimed that his wife had handled all the financial paperwork and that he'd trusted her completely without reviewing the documents she prepared. Victoria retaliated by providing investigators with evidence of Richard's offshore accounts, information she'd kept as leverage for exactly this kind of situation. Alexander attempted to distance himself from both parents, claiming that he'd provided legal services in good faith without knowledge of their criminal activities. But the evidence trail was too comprehensive for him to escape responsibility. His legal threats weren't just ethics violations, they were criminal obstruction of justice, and the FBI was now investigating whether he'd participated in a conspiracy to defraud his parents' victims. The speed of their downfall was breathtaking. Within 6 weeks, Richard's real estate empire was in bankruptcy proceedings. Victoria had been removed from all charity positions and was facing criminal charges, and Alexander's legal career was over regardless of whether he went to prison. The family that had seemed untouchable just months earlier was now radioactive. Former friends crossed streets to avoid being seen with them, business associates canceled deals, and social invitations dried up completely. The financial collapse was total. Richard's assets were frozen while investigators calculated the full extent of his tax evasion and fraud. Victoria's personal accounts were emptied to pay restitution to the charities she'd robbed. Alexander's law firm partnership was dissolved, and his share of the practice was seized to cover potential liability from his misconduct. The mansion that had symbolized their power and status went up for sale, but nobody wanted to buy property owned by a family under criminal investigation. The country club, where they'd hosted Alexander's celebration, revoked their membership to avoid negative publicity. Even their longtime housekeeper quit because they couldn't afford to pay her anymore. But beyond the financial devastation, the social exile was perhaps even more crushing for people who'd built their identities around status and reputation. These were individuals who measured their worth by their position in society's hierarchy, and they'd gone from the top to the bottom overnight. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, monitoring news coverage and court filings while maintaining my cover as an uninvolved family member. When reporters contacted me for comment about my family's legal troubles, I expressed shock and disappointment, claiming that I'd been estranged from their business activities for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's previous treatment of me as an embarrassing outsider now provided perfect cover for my role in their destruction. Because they'd spent years publicly distancing themselves from me, nobody suspected that the poor, unsuccessful daughter could have orchestrated such a sophisticated takedown of their criminal enterprise. Emma noticed that we weren't visiting Grandma and Grandpa anymore, and she asked innocent questions about why they weren't calling us. I told her that the grown-ups in our family were having some problems and needed time to work things out. She seemed relieved rather than upset, which confirmed my suspicion that she'd never felt comfortable around my parents anyway. The investigation continued expanding as more victims came forward. Once the news coverage made Richard's business practices public, people who'd been too scared to speak up before found the courage to file complaints with law enforcement. Each new victim provided additional evidence of the family's criminal pattern, making the case against them even stronger. Mrs. Chen finally got justice when prosecutors used her testimony to prove that Richard had systematically targeted vulnerable elderly homeowners. Miguel Hernandez was able to pursue his unpaid bills through bankruptcy court now that Alexander couldn't threaten him with bogus immigration consequences. Other victims found lawyers willing to file civil lawsuits now that criminal proceedings had established clear evidence of fraud. The perfect storm I'd created was accomplishing something beyond my wildest dreams. It wasn't just destroying my family's ability to hurt me, it was providing justice for everyone they'd victimized over the decades. All those vulnerable people who'd been too scared or too powerless to fight back were finally seeing their abusers face consequences. But the storm wasn't finished yet. The criminal cases were just beginning to work their way through the courts, and I had one final surprise prepared for my family's last desperate attempt to maintain their power. They still thought they could manipulate their way out of consequences, still believed that their wealth and connections would protect them from real accountability. They were about to learn that some storms don't just damage the landscape. They transform it completely, washing away old structures to make room for something better to grow in their place. The family emergency meeting was called for a Saturday morning in early November, held in Alexander's downtown office, because the mansion was now swarming with federal investigators conducting a comprehensive search for additional evidence. Victoria arrived wearing sunglasses indoors, trying to hide the stress that had aged her 5 years in 2 months. Richard looked like a broken man, his usual commanding presence replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who finally understood he was facing real consequences for his actions. Alexander paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his expensive suit wrinkled and his normally perfect hair disheveled. The suspension from his law firm had stripped away his professional armor, revealing the insecure bully underneath. Emma was with a babysitter, spared from witnessing what I knew would be the final confrontation with her toxic relatives. "We need to present a united front," Alexander began without preamble. "The prosecutors are trying to turn us against each other, but if we coordinate our stories and support each other publicly, we can get through this." His lawyer's training was evident in how he framed their criminal conspiracy as a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. Victoria nodded eagerly, grasping at any hope of avoiding prison time. "We've always been a strong family. If we stick together, show that these charges are just attacks on successful people, we can rebuild." Her charity work had taught her how to present herself as a victim, and she was applying those skills to her current situation. Richard was more direct about what he expected from me. Rebecca, I know we've had our differences over the years, but family is family. We need you to make a statement to the press supporting us, explaining that you've never seen any evidence of wrongdoing. His tone suggested that my cooperation wasn't really a request. The offer that followed was designed to be irresistible. $500,000 in cash, transferred immediately to an offshore account they'd helped me establish. A trust fund for Emma worth $2 million, ensuring she'd never face financial insecurity again. Full integration into the family business once this legal misunderstanding was resolved, with a guaranteed position that would make me financially independent for life. All you have to do is tell the truth, Victoria said, her voice honey-sweet with manipulation. Tell everyone that we're good people who've been unfairly targeted by overzealous prosecutors looking to make names for themselves by attacking successful families. She was offering me everything I'd ever wanted from them: money, security, acceptance, and love. For a moment, I let them think I was considering their offer. I asked questions about the trust fund structure, the offshore account logistics, and my future role in their business operations. They became animated as they sensed my possible cooperation, with Alexander pulling out legal documents he'd prepared to formalize our agreement. This has to remain absolutely confidential, Alexander emphasized as he laid out contracts for my signature. If prosecutors know we've made these arrangements, they'll claim we're buying your testimony. But as long as you stay quiet about the financial considerations, your statement will carry tremendous weight. Richard added his own incentive to their offer. Once this is over, we'll make sure you have the respect you deserve. No more living paycheck to paycheck, no more worrying about Emma's future. You'll be part of the inner circle, involved in all family decisions. He was promising me the acceptance I'd craved my entire life. They spent an hour detailing their offer, painting a picture of the life Emma and I could have if I just helped them escape the consequences of their criminal actions. They showed me bank statements proving they could deliver on their financial promises, property deeds for houses where we could live, and investment portfolios that would fund Emma's education at the most prestigious schools. When they finally finished their presentation, I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. For 30 seconds, I let them believe I was seriously considering their offer. Then I turned around and smiled, but it wasn't the grateful expression they were expecting. That's a generous offer, I said calmly. But you're missing one crucial detail. I pulled out my phone and stopped the recording app that had been capturing our entire conversation. I'm the one who destroyed your lives. The silence in the room was absolute. Victoria's mouth fell open in shock. Richard's face went from hopeful to confused to furious in the span of seconds. Alexander's legal mind immediately grasped the implications, and he sank into his chair as if he'd been punched. I documented every crime you've committed for decades, I continued, my voice steady and confident. I provided evidence to the FBI, the IRS, the State Bar Association, and every news outlet in the city. I coordinated with your victims to ensure they'd have the courage to testify against you. Every single piece of evidence that's destroying your lives came from me. Victoria found her voice first, but it came out as a strangled whisper. That's impossible. You don't have access to our business records. You don't understand our operations. She was still trying to convince herself that I was lying. James Walsh gave me everything, I revealed, watching Richard's face turn ashen. Your business partner felt guilty about all the people you'd hurt together, and he wanted to make amends before his cancer killed him. Every fraudulent transaction, every bribed inspector, every falsified document. I have copies of everything. Alexander stood up so quickly his chair fell over. You recorded this conversation illegally. Nothing you just captured can be used in court. His lawyer's training was trying to find legal technicalities that could protect them. I don't need to use it in court, I replied with satisfaction. I already have enough evidence to put all of you in prison for decades. This recording is just for my personal enjoyment. I paused to let that sink in. Although I might share it with the prosecutors if you try to claim this was all some kind of misunderstanding. The transformation in their behavior was immediate and terrifying. Richard lunged toward me, his face purple with rage, screaming about ungrateful children and family loyalty. After everything we've done for you, We raised you. We supported you. We gave you everything. His hands were reaching for my throat when Alexander grabbed him. Victoria started crying, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure rage. You destroyed your own family. You destroyed Emma's future. What kind of monster hurts her own child to get revenge? The irony of her accusing me of hurting Emma was so complete it was almost funny. Alexander was the most dangerous because his legal mind immediately started calculating ways to hurt me. This won't end with us going to prison, he threatened. We'll make sure everyone knows what you did. We'll destroy your reputation so completely that you'll never find work anywhere. We'll prove that you're an unfit mother and take Emma away from you. But his threats revealed how little he'd learned from our previous confrontation. With what resources? I asked calmly. Your law license is gone. Your money is frozen. Your reputation is destroyed. You have no power left to threaten me with. The police arrived 15 minutes later in response to a call I'd made before the meeting started. I'd informed them that I was meeting with subjects of a federal investigation and was concerned about potential intimidation or threats. The officer who responded had been briefed about my family's criminal cases, and he immediately recognized the volatile situation. Richard was arrested for assault and making terroristic threats based on my testimony and the recording of his attack. Victoria and Alexander were released, but warned that any attempt to contact or intimidate me would result in additional criminal charges for witness tampering. As they were led away in handcuffs, Victoria screamed at me from the hallway. You'll regret this. You'll lose everything. Emma will grow up knowing her mother destroyed her own family. But her threats rang hollow because I'd already lost everything that mattered to them: their respect, their approval, their conditional love. What they didn't understand was that in losing their version of family, I'd found something much more valuable: self-respect, justice, and the knowledge that Emma would grow up in a world where powerful people faced consequences for hurting others. The emergency meeting had accomplished something beyond my wildest expectations. Instead of just providing evidence of their ongoing criminal conspiracy, I'd gotten them to confess their crimes on tape while simultaneously threatening a federal witness. Their lawyer would have advised them to stay quiet and cooperate with investigators, but their arrogance and desperation had led them to create even more evidence against themselves. Walking out of that office building, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of family obligation, the burden of hoping for their love, the fear of their power, all of it was gone. They'd spent my entire life making me feel small and worthless, but in the end, I was the one who'd proven that actions have consequences and that justice was possible even for people who thought they were untouchable. Emma was waiting for me at home, working on a school project about family trees. When I sat down to help her, she asked if we could add more people to our tree besides the relatives who never seemed to like us very much. I told her we could add anyone who made us feel loved and supported, because family wasn't just about blood relations. As we worked on her project together, adding names of friends, teachers, and neighbors who'd shown us kindness over the years, I realized that we'd been building a real family all along. It just didn't include the people whose DNA we shared. The criminal trials began 8 months after my family's arrest, and by then the media attention had transformed our case into a symbol of wealthy families who believed they were above the law. Richard faced 17 felony counts, including tax evasion, fraud, and racketeering. Victoria was charged with embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. Alexander faced disbarment proceedings alongside criminal charges for witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. The prosecutor assigned to the case, District Attorney Sarah Chin, had built her career on taking down white-collar criminals who preyed on vulnerable populations. She'd seen my family's type before: wealthy predators who use their social status as camouflage while systematically exploiting anyone they perceived as weak or helpless. But she'd never had such a comprehensive collection of evidence handed to her by someone with inside knowledge of the criminal enterprise. Your family operated like an organized crime syndicate, DHN explained during one of our preparation meetings. They had defined roles, systematic methods, and they protected each other while targeting victims who couldn't fight back. The only difference between them and traditional organized crime is that they wore expensive suits instead of leather jackets. The evidence I'd provided was so thorough that plea bargain negotiations were impossible. Richard's tax evasion alone carried a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison, and that was before considering the fraud charges that could add decades more. Victoria's charity theft might have been treated as a minor white-collar crime if it had been an isolated incident, but the pattern of exploitation made her a career criminal in the eyes of the law. Alexander's situation was complicated by his role as both a criminal participant and a licensed attorney who'd violated professional ethics. The State Bar Association moved faster than the criminal courts, stripping him of his law license before his trial even began. This professional death sentence meant that, even if he avoided prison time, his career was over permanently. The victims who testified during the trials provided heartbreaking evidence of how my family's greed had destroyed lives. Mrs. Chin, now 82 and using a walker, explained how the sale of her family home had left her unable to afford proper medical care for her late husband's final illness. Miguel Hernandez described declaring bankruptcy after Richard refused to pay for completed construction work, leading to the loss of his family's small business and their home. But the most damaging testimony came from James Walsh, Richard's former business partner who was now dying of cancer and had decided to confess everything before facing his final judgment. James provided hour after hour of detailed testimony about their criminal partnership, describing specific fraudulent transactions and the systematic targeting of vulnerable victims. "We looked for people who couldn't fight back," James testified, his voice weak but clear. Elderly homeowners who didn't understand current market values, immigrant contractors who were afraid of deportation, small business owners who couldn't afford lawyers. Richard always said that business was about finding advantages, and our advantage was that we could destroy people who challenged us. The defense attorneys tried every strategy they could think of to minimize their client's culpability. Richard's lawyer argued that he was just a successful businessman who'd made some accounting errors. Victoria's attorney claimed she was a devoted mother and charity volunteer who'd been manipulated by her husband. Alexander's legal team painted him as a lawyer who'd trusted his parents too much and provided services without fully understanding their illegal nature. But the evidence was overwhelming, and my testimony tied everything together in a way that made their coordinated criminal enterprise undeniable. I spent 3 days on the witness stand, walking the jury through years of systematic abuse, manipulation, and criminal activity. The defense attorneys tried to paint me as a bitter daughter seeking revenge, but the documentary evidence supported every claim I made. The most powerful moment came when Alexander's attorney tried to discredit my testimony by pointing out that I'd secretly recorded our final family meeting. "Isn't it true that you deliberately deceived your own family to entrap them into making incriminating statements?" he asked, trying to make me look like the villain. I documented their final attempt to obstruct justice and intimidate a federal witness, I replied calmly. They offered me money to lie for them, and when I refused, they threatened violence. That's not entrapment. That's evidence of ongoing criminal behavior. The verdicts came back unanimous on all charges. Richard was convicted on every count and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Victoria received 12 years for her charity fraud and money laundering, with restitution orders that would keep her in debt for the rest of her life. Alexander was sentenced to 8 years for witness intimidation and conspiracy, with his law license permanently revoked. But the criminal convictions were only part of their punishment. The civil lawsuits filed by their victims resulted in judgments that stripped away every remaining asset. The mansion was sold to pay restitution, with the proceeds distributed among the people they'd defrauded. Their investment portfolios, offshore accounts, and business interests were liquidated to compensate victims for decades of exploitation. The social destruction was equally complete. Former friends testified as character witnesses for the prosecution, describing how my family had bragged about their ability to manipulate the legal system and exploit vulnerable people. The country club expelled them permanently, and every charitable organization in the city banned them from future participation. Alexander's wife Amanda filed for divorce before his sentencing, taking their children and moving across the country to escape the scandal. She'd married into what she thought was a respectable family and instead found herself connected to criminals whose names had become synonymous with greed and cruelty. The news coverage throughout the trials was extensive, with reporters describing the case as an example of how wealthy families could operate criminal enterprises for decades without consequences. Editorial writers used my family's convictions to discuss the need for stronger oversight of charitable organizations and more aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime. But the most satisfying coverage came from business publications that detailed how my family's criminal convictions had sent shockwaves through the real estate industry. Several other companies were now under investigation for similar practices, and new regulations were being implemented to protect vulnerable homeowners from predatory developers. Emma, now 7 years old, understood that her grandparents and uncle had gone to prison for hurting people, but she didn't seem traumatized by their absence. In fact, she seemed relieved that we no longer had to attend those stressful family gatherings where she'd always felt unwanted and unwelcome. The prosecutor's office offered me a position as a victim advocate, helping other people navigate the criminal justice system when they'd been exploited by wealthy criminals. The salary was modest but stable, with excellent benefits and the kind of meaningful work that felt like a calling rather than just a job. 6 months after the trials ended, I received a letter from Richard in federal prison. He was serving his time at a minimum security facility designed for white-collar criminals, but even comfortable prison was still prison for a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. The letter was filled with self-pity and demands for forgiveness, claiming that he'd learned his lesson and deserved a second chance. I read the letter once, then filed it in my trash can without responding. Richard had spent my entire life teaching me that actions had consequences, that people who made poor choices deserved whatever punishment they received. I was simply applying his own philosophy to his situation. Emma and I were building a new life based on honesty, integrity, and genuine relationships with people who valued us for who we were rather than what we could provide them. We had less money than when I was receiving my family's conditional support, but we had something much more valuable: peace, dignity, and the knowledge that we'd helped ensure justice for people who'd been hurt by wealthy predators. The little girl who'd once cried because her grandparents told her she was too poor to call them family was now growing up in a home where love wasn't conditional on bank account balances, and where standing up for what's right mattered more than maintaining comfortable relationships with cruel people. Justice had been served, and it was more satisfying than I'd ever imagined possible. 2 years after my family's convictions, Emma and I had built a life that felt like stepping into sunlight after years of living in shadows. My work as a victim advocate had connected me with dozens of families who'd survived exploitation by wealthy criminals, and helping them navigate the legal system had given me a sense of purpose that no amount of money could have provided. Emma was thriving in her new school, a public elementary with dedicated teachers who saw potential in every child regardless of their family's economic status. She'd joined the art club and made friends who invited her to birthday parties and sleepovers, normal childhood experiences that had been impossible when we were trapped in my family's toxic dynamic. The transformation in Emma's personality was remarkable. She laughed more, asked questions without fear, and had developed a confidence that came from knowing she was valued for herself rather than judged by her family's financial situation. When her second-grade class studied community helpers, she proudly told everyone that her mommy helped people who'd been hurt by bad guys. My work had introduced me to David Rodriguez, a social worker who specialized in helping families recover from financial abuse. David was a single father raising his 8-year-old daughter Sarah after his wife died in a car accident 3 years earlier. Our first conversations were professional. He was helping one of my clients understand their legal options, but we quickly discovered a shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. David's approach to parenting was everything my own family had failed to provide. Patient, encouraging, and focused on building Sarah's character rather than her achievements. When Emma and Sarah met during a picnic for families in our victim advocacy program, they bonded immediately over their shared love of art and animals. Watching David interact with both girls revealed the kind of father I'd always wished Emma could have. He listened to their ideas seriously, encouraged their creativity, and treated their feelings as important regardless of how trivial the issues might seem to adults. When Emma showed him a drawing she'd made of our small apartment, he praised her artistic talent and asked thoughtful questions about the details she'd included. Our friendship developed slowly and naturally, without the dramatic intensity that had characterized my previous relationships. David understood that trust was something I'd have to rebuild carefully after years of family betrayal, and he never pushed for more intimacy than I was ready to provide. Instead, he showed up consistently, kept his promises, and treated Emma and me with the respect that should have been our birthright. 6 months into our relationship, Emma made an observation that stopped my heart in the best possible way. "Mommy, David looks at you the way daddies look at mommies in movies," she said while we were making dinner together. "And he looks at me like I'm important too." The fact that she recognized genuine love and acceptance spoke to how much she'd healed from the rejection she'd experienced with my birth family. David's proposal came during a family camping trip that included both girls, a weekend adventure that felt more like home than any mansion ever had. He didn't ask for my hand in marriage as much as he asked if we wanted to become a real family together, if Emma and Sarah wanted to become sisters, and if I wanted to partner with him in raising strong, confident daughters who knew their worth wasn't measured by external validation. Emma's answer was immediate and enthusiastic. "Yes! Can Sarah really be my sister? Can David really be my daddy?" Her joy at gaining a father who actually wanted her was so pure that I cried happy tears for the first time in years. Our wedding was small and perfect, held in the community center where I'd first started working with victim families. The guest list included Linda, who'd helped me gather evidence against my family, DA Sarachan, who'd become a close friend during the trials, and dozens of families whose lives had been rebuilt after escaping financial abuse. Emma and Sarah served as joint flower girls, wearing matching dresses they'd picked out together. The ceremony itself focused on the family we were creating together, with vows that emphasized our commitment to honesty, mutual support, and raising our daughters to believe in justice and compassion. David promised to love Emma as his own daughter, to protect her from anyone who tried to make her feel less valuable because of her background. When the officiant pronounced us a family, Emma threw her arms around David's neck and whispered, "Daddy," with such genuine happiness that every adult in the room was crying. The little girl who'd once been told she was too poor to call her own grandparents family now had a father who was proud to claim her as his daughter. Our honeymoon was a week at the beach with both girls, building sandcastles and collecting shells and creating the kind of memories that would anchor our children in love for the rest of their lives. Emma had never seen the ocean before, and watching her experience that vast beauty while feeling completely secure in our love was magical. The legal adoption process for Emma was completed 6 months after our marriage, giving her David's last name and the legal protection that came with having a father who would never abandon her. When the judge asked Emma if she wanted David to be her daddy forever, she stood up in the courtroom and announced, "He's already my daddy in my heart, but now it's official." 3 months after the adoption, we received notice that Richard was applying for early parole, claiming that his advanced age and good behavior in prison qualified him for compassionate release. The parole hearing would allow victims to provide testimony about whether his release would pose a danger to the community. Emma, now 9 years old and secure in her new family's love, asked if she could attend the hearing. "I want to tell them that Grandpa Richard was mean to us and that he shouldn't get out early when other people had to serve their whole sentences," she said with the moral clarity that comes from growing up in a household where justice matters. David and I decided that Emma was old enough to understand the situation and strong enough to handle seeing Richard in prison clothes. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and we prepared Emma by explaining that sometimes bad people try to get out of punishment early by pretending they've changed. Richard looked much older than his 68 years, his hair completely white and his expensive suits replaced by orange prison uniforms. When he saw Emma in the courtroom audience, sitting between David and me, his face showed a mixture of shame and desperate hope. The parole board allowed Emma to speak, and she stood up with the confidence that comes from knowing she's protected by people who genuinely love her. Richard Martinez hurt my mommy and me because we didn't have as much money as other people in our family, she said clearly. He made me feel like I wasn't good enough to be his granddaughter. My real daddy would never hurt me like that, so I don't think Richard should get out early when he hasn't learned how to be nice to people. Her testimony was brief, but devastating because it came from the heart of a child who'd experienced both rejection and unconditional love. The parole board denied Richard's application unanimously, noting that his crimes had targeted vulnerable populations and that early release would send the wrong message about accountability for white-collar crime. As we left the hearing, Emma asked if she would have to see Richard again. I told her that he would remain in prison for many more years, and that even after his release, we would never have to see him unless we chose to. Good, she said simply. I already have a grandpa now anyway, referring to David's father, who'd welcomed both Emma and me into his family with open arms. The contrast between my birth family and my chosen family couldn't have been more stark. Where my parents had demanded perfection and measured love by financial success, David's family celebrated authenticity and valued character over achievement. Where my family had used shame and manipulation to maintain control, David's family used encouragement and support to help each member reach their potential. Emma was growing up surrounded by people who saw her intelligence, creativity, and kindness as treasures to be nurtured rather than flaws to be corrected. She was developing into a confident young woman who believed in her own worth and understood that real families are built on love, respect, and mutual support rather than shared DNA. 5 years after my family's criminal convictions, I was asked to speak at a conference for financial abuse survivors about the importance of holding wealthy criminals accountable for their actions. The audience included social workers, prosecutors, and families who were still fighting for justice against predators who'd exploited their vulnerability. Breaking free from family abuse is possible, I told the audience, but it requires accepting that some people are toxic regardless of their relationship to you. Children deserve protection from adults who hurt them, even when those adults are grandparents. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is remove them from relationships that teach them they're not worthy of respect and kindness. The speech was recorded and posted online, where it was seen by thousands of people struggling with similar situations. I received emails from adult children of wealthy families who'd been made to feel worthless because they couldn't meet impossible standards, from grandchildren who'd been treated as embarrassments because their parents weren't successful enough, and from people who'd been convinced that abuse was acceptable if it came from family members. Each email reminded me that Emma and I weren't the only people who'd escaped toxic family dynamics to build healthier lives based on chosen relationships rather than biological obligations. Our story had become part of a larger movement of people who refused to accept that DNA created an obligation to tolerate abuse. As Emma approached her 10th birthday, she asked if we could invite some of the families I'd helped through my victim advocacy work to her party. They're kind of like our family too, she explained, because you helped them when they needed help, just like David helped us when we needed a daddy. The birthday party was held in our backyard, with children from a dozen families who'd rebuilt their lives after escaping financial abuse. Emma blew out her candles surrounded by people who understood that real family is created through love, support, and shared values rather than shared blood. Later that evening, as David and I tucked Emma into bed, she asked if I was sad that her birth grandparents couldn't see how happy she was now. I thought about her question carefully before answering. Sometimes people make choices that prevent them from being part of good things, I told her. Richard and Victoria chose to value money more than people, and that choice meant they couldn't be the kind of grandparents you deserved. But their loss became our gain, because it taught us to appreciate the people who do love us for who we are. Emma nodded seriously, then brightened as she remembered something. Tomorrow I'm going to draw a picture of our whole family to show my teacher. It's going to be really big because we have so many people who love us now. As David and I sat on our front porch that night, watching fireflies dance in our small but comfortable yard, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed. We lived in a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood, drove used cars, and carefully budgeted for family vacations. By my birth family standards, we were still poor. But Emma was growing up knowing that her worth wasn't determined by her bank account, that love wasn't conditional on success, and that justice was possible even against powerful people who seemed untouchable. She was surrounded by adults who protected her, encouraged her dreams, and treated her with the respect that every child deserves. The little girl who'd once been told she was too poor to call her own grandparents' family had grown into a confident young woman who understood that real families are built on love, kindness, and mutual respect. And that was worth more than all the money in the world. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building a life so beautiful that their absence becomes a blessing rather than a loss. Emma and I had done exactly that, and we were living proof that chosen families can be stronger than biological ones when they're built on the foundation of genuine love. Every day, I was grateful that my family's cruelty had forced us to find better people to love and be loved by. Their rejection had become our liberation, and their loss had become our greatest gain. What do you think about families that use money as a weapon to control and hurt their own relatives? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself or your children from toxic behavior? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from others who've faced similar situations. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help other people find it. Subscribe to hear more stories about standing up to family bullies and building healthier relationships. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve better treatment from the people who claim to love them. Remember, you can't choose the family you're born into, but you can absolutely choose the family you build. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who make you feel small, even when those people share your DNA. Thanks for watching, and remember that your worth isn't measured by your bank account. It's measured by how you treat others and how you protect the people who depend on you. Keep fighting for what's right, and never let anyone convince you that abuse is acceptable just because it comes from family. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.